Christians should expect to suffer in all the ways that everybody else suffers. That's the first thing I would say. So I think when you think about suffering, you can distinguish 5 types of suffering. There's this normal suffering that everybody goes through, death, decay, disease. Those are the kinds of things that come to us all, and Christians shouldn't expect to be free from that. They should expect to be walked through those things with God and with God's people, but they shouldn't expect to be immune from living in a fallen world and experiencing the consequences of living in a fallen world. But I think that Christians need to be aware that as well as that normal suffering, there are other types of suffering that exist, and some of those types of sufferings are particularly appropriate to think of in Christian terms. So I'll just distinguish those types of suffering, and then we'll deal with the type of suffering that Christians should expect to face in particular. So there's the normal suffering. There is abnormal suffering, the kind of suffering that happens in a massive earthquake, where people look at suffering and think, what on earth is going on? How can we look at that suffering and believe in a God of love? Of course, there are answers to those questions, but we have to admit that sometimes suffering is at such a scale and at such an intensity that we wonder how that can be possible. So normal suffering, abnormal suffering, and then what I would call innocent suffering, where there is clearly a victim and a perpetrator. You might think of child abuse, for example. The child has done nothing to ask for that. The perpetrator, the person who's guilty, has done that, and there's no link between the sufferer and the reason that they're suffering at all. And that's something that we should be dismayed by and work against in every way we can. Of course, there's the suffering we deserve, the suffering that comes, for example, when you go beyond the speed limit and you get a fine. That's suffering. It's sore, it hurts, but it's absolutely what you should get because you broke a law. But those 4 types of suffering, although all Christians might experience them, are not particularly tied to their Christian faith as such. However, there is this 5th type of suffering, which I'm going to call suffering for righteousness' sake. And that is the type of suffering that Christians all should expect to go through. If you think of what Paul says to Timothy in 2 Timothy, he says, all Christians who want to live a righteous life will be persecuted. So if you live a righteous life, Paul's argument is, you will definitely be persecuted because of that righteous life. And all Christians should be expecting that kind of suffering and be prepared for that kind of suffering, signing up for that kind of suffering before they start the Christian life, counting the cost of that kind of suffering on the way into the Christian life. Paul explains to the churches that he plants in Acts that through all kinds of tribulations, people will enter the kingdom of heaven. There will be suffering that will come because we're Christians and because we're standing for Christ, because we're standing for Christian morality or ethics in this world. And we should expect that kind of suffering, suffering for righteousness' sake, suffering for the gospel. The kind of suffering that Jesus experienced, the kind of suffering that Paul himself experienced. Those are the things that we are called to suffer with Christ. And the apostles and everybody who writes in the Bible says it is an honor to suffer like that with Christ.